I wanted to update you on kind of where we're going to go from here in terms of what we talk about on Sunday mornings during the fall. I've mentioned a couple times over the summer that having come off a 9-month series on the Gospel of Mark, we took a little break from series, and during the summer we've just had standalone messages, maybe 2-week series here and there. But today and next week are going to be the final weeks of these standalone messages, and so I thought it'd be good for me to let you know what's going to come after that. Starting on September 15th, I am planning to do a topical series on Christians' participation in the political process. You might have heard that there is a presidential campaign happening. Is anybody aware of that? No? Nobody's aware of that? Okay. And I think that it's important with how toxic politics have become in the United States that we address this as a church. Now, I did this in 2020, but a lot of you weren't here in 2020, and so I think it bears repeating, and a lot of you that were here won't remember anything that we said in 2020. And so I think that it bears kind of going over some of this stuff again. Some things are just worth saying again and again, and I've felt impressed to share on this topic again, and so it's likely going to be a 4-week series, and hopefully I won't regret telling you that, as hopefully attendance doesn't plummet come September 15th, but I think it's going to be good, and I think that it'll be a benefit to all of us, the things that will be shared during that series. So I encourage you to be a part of that. And then in mid to late October, we'll enter into our next series on the Bible, and a book of the Bible, I should say. And I am currently deciding which book of the Bible that will be. Not taking suggestions. I'm just going to decide. So anyway, but I'll announce that a little closer to the time. So I just want to give you a little heads up as to where we're going in the coming weeks. But today and next week, I want to look at one of my favorite Old Testament stories, and that is the story of the calling of Gideon and how Gideon led God's people to an improbable and great victory over their enemies. And so today we're going to be in the 6th chapter of the book of Judges, and we're going to consider 4 lessons that we learn from the call of Gideon. The first thing that we need to know about this story is the context. What was happening in Israel at the time this story begins, what the condition of Israel was like at the time of Gideon. And so to provide us that context, I want to begin our reading in Judges chapter 6, verses 1 through 6. It should be on the screen, but for today, I'm just going to do the reading. We've had a lot of responsive reading or reading together, but today I'm just going to do the reading, and you follow along as I do. This first section, again, Judges 6, 1 through 6. The Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight, and so the Lord handed them over to the Midianites for 7 years. The Midianites were so cruel that the Israelites made hiding places for themselves in the mountains, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, marauders from Midian, Amalek, and the people of the east would attack Israel, camping in the land and destroying crops as far away as Gaza. They left the Israelites with nothing to eat, taking all the sheep, goats, cattle, and donkeys. These enemy hordes, coming with their livestock and tents, were as thick as locusts. They arrived on droves of camels too numerous to count, and they stayed until the land was stripped bare. So Israel was reduced to starvation by the Midianites. Then the Israelites cried out to the Lord for help. And so the setting for this story, the context, and if you're familiar with the Old Testament, you'll understand that yet again, Israel did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And so God had given them into the hands of their enemies, the Midianites. It's important to understand that the book of Judges is set, it occurs, the events there occur after Israel had possessed the land that God had promised them. So you remember that the people of Israel had wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. But eventually, under the leadership of Joshua, they had come to actually possess the land that God had promised them. But there was a problem with their taking of the land. There was a problem with their possession of the land. When they possessed the promised land, God had told them that they were supposed to completely drive out the inhabitants of the land, the enemies of God and of Israel. But they didn't. They didn't do what God told them. They did not drive out the inhabitants of the land. They left these other pagan peoples in the land. And not only that, but over time, they started to adopt and worship the false gods of these pagan peoples. They worshiped the false gods. They engaged in the sinful practices of the pagan peoples. And so this is why the text says that they did evil in the sight of the Lord. In some translations, chapter 6 begins by noting that they did evil in God's sight again, because that's really the story of the book of Judges. God delivers his people. Out of appreciation for that, they serve him for a while. But then they grow complacent in their safety and living under the benefits of God's blessing. And then they reject him again, and they begin to serve other gods, and they begin to sin against him again. And then in loving discipline, God allows life to get hard for them. And then they turn back to him. He delivers them again. And the cycle just repeats itself over and over and over again. It's really a theme that runs through the entirety of the Old Testament. And if we're honest, it's the theme of mankind in general, and it's the life theme of all of us in here today. God is good to us. God delivers us. We live in appreciation for a time. And so often then we begin to drift away, turn away. Life gets hard. We turn back. God is gracious. And often you see this cycle play out in people's life. And so the story of Gideon begins with unfaithful Israel oppressed by Midian because Israel is under the discipline of God. And in this story, one of the things we discover is that the purpose of God in allowing his people to face difficulty, the purpose of God's discipline is always to persuade people to return to him. That's the purpose of God's discipline. In their lives then, if we come under God's discipline now, this is still God's purpose for discipline. God's discipline is never a punitive thing. God's discipline is not an outlet for his anger or his outrage. God's discipline is always toward a redemptive purpose. It's always toward getting people to come back to him, getting people to return to him. And so his discipline here in Judges 6 looked like this. The Midianites would allow Israel to plant and grow crops. They would allow them to raise and care for their livestock. But then, before Israel could actually harvest their crops, and then before they could actually benefit from the livestock they had raised, the Midianites would sweep in and they would plunder everything that Israel had. And we see in verse 6 that God's discipline achieved its purpose, and the people of Israel, having been impoverished at the hands of the Midianites, finally cried out again to God for help. And so this is the setting, this is the context within which we are going to be introduced to Gideon. And because God's discipline has achieved its purpose and the people are crying out to him for help, God purposes to save his people from the Midianites, and he sets in motion a plan to deliver them. And his plan included choosing Gideon to lead the Israelites to overthrow Midian and gain freedom from their oppressors. In verses 7 through 10, we're not going to read those, but we find that when Israel first cried out to God, he sent them a prophet who reminded them of their deliverance from Egypt, reminded them that they had disobeyed his command to drive out the inhabitants of the land, reminded them they were instructed not to worship the false gods of the land, and reminded them that they had not listened to him. The prophet reminded them of all of those things. And so with Israel crying out to God for help, with God having reminded them that they've brought this trouble on themselves, God then sets in motion his plan to deliver them. He chooses Gideon to lead the deliverance. And here's what we find in Judges 6, 11 through 16. I think it'll be on the screen, but again, I'll read. You follow along. Then the angel of the Lord came and sat beneath the great tree at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash of the clan of Abiezer. Gideon, son of Joash, was threshing wheat at the bottom of a winepress to hide the grain from the Midianites. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, "Mighty hero, the Lord is with you." "Sir," Gideon replied, "if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? And where are all the miracles our ancestors told us about? Didn't they say the Lord brought us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and handed us over to the Midianites." Then the Lord turned to him and said, "Go with the strength you have and rescue Israel from the Midianites. I am sending you." "But Lord," Gideon replied, "how can I rescue Israel? My clan is the weakest in the whole tribe of Manasseh, and I'm the least in my entire family." The Lord said to him, "I will be with you, and you will destroy the Midianites as if you were fighting against one man." It's an awesome passage of Scripture, such an interesting story. Gideon is chosen by God to deliver Israel. But I want you to notice, I want to highlight a few things about Gideon. First of all, I want you to notice from the text that he's hidden. He's hidden. Gideon is not someone that the community is looking to for leadership. Gideon is literally in hiding. He's threshing wheat in a wine press. He's hiding. He's not out like gathering people together to say, "Hey, it's time we do something about these Midianites. Let's rise up and overthrow." No, he is hiding. Not only that, he's from the weakest clan in Israel, and he's the least in his family. In other words, he is not the one that people would look to for deliverance. He's hiding. He's scared. He's the least. Not only that, but I want you to notice that Gideon is cynical. He's cynical toward God. Far from a picture of faithfulness and confidence in God, he is cynical regarding God's care for Israel. Here are the things he says. "If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened?" Now there's a question that I'm guessing a lot of us have. If the Lord is with us, what in the world is going on? Where are all the wonders our fathers told us about? And then Gideon, he doesn't hold back at all. He goes on and says, "God has abandoned us." He's hidden. He's the least. He's cynical. God knows all of this about Gideon. But the angel of the Lord greets him and calls him mighty hero. Some translations say mighty warrior or mighty man of valor. It almost seems like a joke. He's not a mighty warrior. He's not a mighty hero. He's hidden, he's least, he's afraid, he's cynical. None of this is the profile of a mighty warrior. He was all of those things: hidden, least, afraid, cynical. But here is the more important thing. He was chosen by God. He was chosen. God saw Gideon as he was, but God also saw Gideon as he could be. And every one of us here today, God sees us as we are, but he also sees us as we can be. God sees you as you can be. He sees the person that you can become. God can help you become the person that you are supposed to be, the person that he knows he created you to be. And so Gideon then asked God for a confirming sign. God gives him a confirming sign. And so Gideon builds an altar and worships God. That's all covered in verses 17 through 24. So we have the setting. We have met the man God has chosen to deliver Israel. And then God gives Gideon his first assignment. It's a test of his willingness to do what God tells him to do. Before Midian can be defeated, there's something else that has to be done. Midian cannot be defeated until this is done. The worship of false gods has to stop. The people have to stop worshiping false gods. And so in verses 25 through 27, we find God's first assignment for Gideon. Here's what it says. That night the Lord said to Gideon, "Take the second bull from your father's herd, the one that is 7 years old. Pull down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole standing beside it. Then build an altar to the Lord your God here on this hilltop sanctuary, laying the stones carefully. Sacrifice the bull as a burnt offering on the altar, using as fuel the wood of the Asherah pole you cut down." So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord had commanded, but he did it at night because he was afraid of the other members of his father's household and the people of the town. So he was obedient, but he was still struggling with fear. But what I really want to focus on is understanding the significance of this first assignment that God has given him. What appears to be the case is that not only was the altar to Baal and the Asherah pole Gideon's father's, but it appears this was the altar and the Asherah pole for the men of the town. So this was the place of the worship of false gods for the men of the town. Baal, if you're not familiar, was a Canaanite god, a fertility god. And Asherah was sometimes regarded as his mother and sometimes regarded as his wife. But either way, the pagans believed that Baal and Asherah were responsible for fruitfulness, for crop harvest, for the birth of children, anything that could fall under the heading of fertility. And we're going to be PG-13 here for just a minute. And so what often occurred with the worship of Baal, not always, but often, is that an altar to Baal and an Asherah pole, which is simply a pole that represents Asherah, would be located together. And because the pagans believed that it was the sexual union of Baal and Asherah that resulted in fertility, they would often worship by having sexual relations on the high places, which were the hills where the altar and the Asherah pole were located. And they did this thinking that it would arouse the gods to have sex that would result in fertility. So, whenever you decide that God's people in 2024 are the biggest mess God's people have ever been. I just want you to remember this story and realize that God's people have been a huge mess for a really long time. There have been times that it's been even worse than it is today. And here's another thing I want you to remember. Even people doing these kinds of vile things, okay, God's people doing what I just talked about in worship of false gods. Understand, God wanted those people to return to him. God didn't write those people off. God still loved them and wanted them to return. So Gideon is instructed to tear down the altar to Baal and the Asherah pole of his father, of his family, and their entire town. It's a big deal. It's a big deal. Imagine being tasked with doing something like that. I mean, what are some idols we have today? Imagine your husband has made an idol out of an old sports car. And God told you to take it out to Buckeye Lake, park it on the boat ramp, put it in neutral, and give it a push. Imagine, I'm sorry to be so, the word is escaping me, so. Imagine your wife has made an idol out of shoes. I knew I shouldn't have done this. And God told you to gather all her shoes in a pile in the backyard and burn them. Some of you ladies can't even laugh at that because the idea is just so awful. Or you're so mad at me for being so misogynistic with my example. I know a lot of guys who have a lot of shoes in their closet too, so. All right. Can we move on? Can you forgive me for the bad examples? All right. Here's the point. Doing something about another person's idol is a big deal. It's a big deal. I'm guessing none of you would actually do that with the car on the boat ramp. But a car can be an idol. And I'm guessing none of us would burn our spouse's shoes, whether it was the husband or the wife that loves shoes too much. We wouldn't do that. Tearing down someone's idol is a big deal. What God asked Gideon to do was a big deal, but it had to happen. And here's why it had to happen. Because Israel cannot be delivered from Midian until the false gods have come down. Israel can't be delivered until the false gods have been destroyed and the idolatry has stopped. And so Gideon did as instructed. He tore the idols down. And he built an altar to God, to Yahweh, on top of the altar to Baal, where it had been. And he uses the wood of the Asherah pole to burn the sacrifice to the Lord. We're told he was afraid when he did it, but he did it. It's a courageous thing to do. You know, courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is doing what needs to be done even though you're afraid. And Gideon did that. He did it. And we see the response to that in verses 28 through 32. Early the next morning, as the people of the town began to stir, someone discovered that the altar of Baal had been broken down and the Asherah pole beside it had been cut down. In their place, a new altar had been built, and on it were the remains of the bull that had been sacrificed. The people said to each other, "Who did this?" And after asking around and making a careful search, they learned that it was Gideon, the son of Joash. "Bring out your son," The men of the town demanded of Joash, "He must die for destroying the altar of Baal and for cutting down the Asherah pole." But Joash shouted to the mob that confronted him, "Why are you defending Baal? Will you argue his case? Whoever pleads his case will be put to death by morning. If Baal truly is God, let him defend himself and destroy the one who broke down his altar." From then on, Gideon was called Jerubbaal, which means let Baal defend himself, because he broke down Baal's altar. Of course, Baal did nothing, because Baal wasn't really a god. It's a remarkable story. Faithless Israel crying out for God's help. God chooses a hidden, cynical, scared man who is the least in his family to be Israel's deliverer. And God's first assignment for Gideon is to tear down the false gods of his family. He does it, and the false god is exposed as powerless. Interesting story. And it's going to be even more interesting next week. So that's the story, but what's the relevance for us today? Are there lessons from this ancient story that we can apply to our own lives that we can take encouragement from? And the answer is yes, there are. And for just a few minutes, I want to highlight 4 lessons from this story that are applicable to our lives in 2024. And here's the first important lesson from this story. You might today be in an out-of-the-way hidden season in your life. You might today even be scared of the circumstances that you're facing in life right now. But God knows where you are. He knows what you are capable of with His help. And God has a good plan for you. He has a good plan for you. You might feel today like you're part of the weakest clan. You might feel today like you are the least in your family or at your work or in your social circle. And that might even be true. But God knows who you can be, and God has a plan for you. You just need to be willing to accept it as God begins to work His plan in your life. No matter how inadequate you feel here today, no matter how disadvantaged you might be, no matter how the experiences of your life have caused you to go into a shell and go into hiding, when God taps you on the shoulder and says, it's time to come out of hiding, you can be certain today that you can do whatever God says you can do. You can. Here's the second lesson. God can turn you from cynicism to faith. Gideon was cynical. We saw it in the text. But he was transformed from cynical to faith-filled. He tore down the altar because cynicism gave way to faith. And next week, we're going to take a look at his victory over the Midianites. And he was able to lead that victory because cynicism was replaced by faith. And here's how it happened. Cynicism was replaced by faith because Gideon had an encounter with God. If you're here today and you're finding yourself cynical, you need a fresh encounter with God. And if you ever encounter God, your cynicism, like Gideon's, will give way to faith. You'll believe again that God cares, and you'll believe again that God delivers. And one of my prayers for today's service is that people in here who are cynical, that today you would move from cynicism to faith, that you would believe again that God really does care for you, that God has not abandoned you, and that God can and will deliver you. And here's the third lesson. Just like with Gideon, the first assignment that God gives those He's going to use is to tear down idols in their lives. If we want to be delivered from our enemy, there are some idols that we need to tear down in our own lives. If Gideon did not tear down the idols and put an end to the idolatry, he would not have led Israel to victory. God would have had to find someone else who would tear down the idols, and until someone would tear down the idols, Israel was not going to be delivered from Midian. It just was not going to happen. Friends, God is really patient with us. I know from experience that God has worked in my life and even used me in seasons where I did have an idol in my life. He's patient, he's long-suffering, he's kind. But our walk with God and our effectiveness for God are always compromised when we engage in idolatry. When something or someone other than God is getting our attention, our affection, our worship. To please God, to walk close to God, to fulfill God's plan for our lives, we have to be willing to tear down the idols in our lives. And I know that none of us here today are kneeling down before an altar to Baal. None of us have an Asherah pole in our homes. I'm sure none of us are kneeling down to little wooden statues. But we are guilty. We are often guilty of idolatry. We serve we serve money instead of God. We serve leisure instead of God. We serve career instead of God. We worship power instead of God. We worship sex instead of God. Some of us love our country more than we love our God. We have idols in our lives. And just like God said to Gideon, he says to us today that the idols have to be torn down. If we're going to obey him, walk with him, see his plan for our lives fulfilled, find the deliverance that we desire from our enemy, the idols in our lives have to be torn down. And so, what idol do you have in your life that needs to be torn down today? And finally, here's a great lesson we take from this story. It's a theme that runs throughout the entirety of the Bible. Here it is. No matter how sinful we may be, no matter how long we've served false gods, no matter how many years we've engaged in idolatry, no matter the depth of our sin and the depth of the evil that we've done in the sight of God, God loves us and is continually inviting us to return to him. Continually. The Israelites at the time of Gideon had been horribly unfaithful to God. I mean, you can't do any worse than they were doing. They had been horribly unfaithful to God, serving Baal, Asherah, engaging in evil. For years on end, they had lived this way. And yet God was still trying to reach them. God still longed for them. And God did allow discipline. He allowed hardship, but it was for only one purpose. It wasn't punitive. It was to get them to return to him. And as soon as they returned, as soon as they turned back to him, he accepted them, and he set in motion a plan to liberate them from their oppressors. Friends, no matter what you have done, no matter what you are doing, God is still reaching out to you. God still desires you. God is inviting you to return to him. You have not gone too far. You have not done too much. You've not ignored God for too long so that he's written you off. God has not written you off. He still desires you, and he still welcomes you to come back to him. And that's what he's calling you to do today. He's asking you, if you need to come back to him. And so my prayer is that these 4 lessons would get into our spirits today, that they would encourage us and that they would change us. You may be hidden and scared, but God knows where you are, and you can do what God says you can do. God can turn your cynicism to faith, and so ask him to do it today. Be honest. If you're cynical, just be honest about it. God, I'm cynical. I don't feel like I've seen you move in a long time, God. But I want to move from cynicism to faith, so God, allow me to encounter you again in a fresh and new way. So ask God to do it today. If you're going to walk with God and be used by God, you're going to have to tear down the idols in your life. So honestly engage with the question today, what idol do I have in my life that needs to come down? And finally, if you've walked away from God again, he's inviting you to return. Let's stand.